The gavel was already in her hand. Judge Catherine Morrison had heard enough. Another elderly man with a stack of papers and a story that didn't quite add up. "I'm sorry, Mr. Patterson," she said, her voice calm but final. "You haven't provided sufficient evidence to support your claims." He didn't protest. Just stood there quietly in his worn suit, holding a cardboard box full of documents he'd sorted by hand. No lawyer had taken his case, so he had taken on the system alone, not out of pride, but out of belief that the truth still mattered. As the judge prepared to bring the hearing to a close, she had no idea what she was about to overlook. Hidden in that box was a letter, handwritten, almost forgotten, that would change everything. That single page would expose 3 decades of unpaid benefits, institutional failure, and the truth no one had been willing to see. And it would prove that this man, dismissed by nearly everyone, had been right all along. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this remarkable story of persistence and unexpected justice, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe that truth deserves its day in court, no matter how long it takes to find it, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing because of viewers like you who understand that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that almost never get told. The Hennepin County Courthouse had seen its share of desperate people clutching manila folders and cardboard boxes, convinced that justice was just one hearing away from vindication. Judge Catherine Morrison had presided over this particular courtroom for 15 years, long enough to recognize the signs of a case that was going nowhere. The shuffling walk of someone who'd been fighting the system too long. The handwritten legal briefs that quoted statute numbers with touching faith in their relevance. The quiet desperation of people who believed that if they could just explain their situation clearly enough, surely someone would listen. Robert Patterson fit the profile perfectly. He'd filed his lawsuit against Consolidated Benefits Corporation 6 months earlier, claiming they owed him 30 years of unpaid military disability benefits. His complaint was handwritten on forms downloaded from the internet, filled with dates and reference numbers that seemed more like wishful thinking than legal evidence. The corporation's lawyers had filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that Patterson's claims were barred by the statute of limitations and lacked any credible documentation. It should have been a 5-minute hearing. Patterson would present his case, the corporate lawyers would point out the obvious flaws, and Morrison would dismiss the suit with the gentle but firm language she'd perfected over years of disappointing people who'd run out of options. She'd seen it hundreds of times before. That Tuesday morning in March, Morrison arrived at her chambers with a full docket and the mild headache that came from knowing she'd spend the day crushing dreams with legal precedent. The Patterson case was scheduled for 10:30, sandwiched between a landlord-tenant dispute and a personal injury claim that would probably settle before lunch. She'd skimmed the file the night before, noting the familiar pattern of a pro-SE plaintiff who'd confused hope with evidence. The courtroom was nearly empty when Patterson entered, carrying his cardboard box like it contained treasures instead of what appeared to be 30 years of accumulated paperwork. He was tall and thin, with silver hair combed carefully back and hands that shook slightly as he arranged his documents on the plaintiff's table. His suit was clean but outdated, the kind worn by someone who'd bought quality once and made it last decades. When he stood for the judge's entrance, his posture was ramrod straight despite his age. Across the aisle, the defense table hosted 3 lawyers in expensive suits, each carrying leather briefcases that probably cost more than Patterson's monthly Social Security check. The lead attorney was Marcus Webb, a partner at Steinberg, Webb and Associates who specialized in corporate defense and had a reputation for making problems disappear efficiently. He'd reviewed Patterson's complaint with the kind of professional disdain reserved for obviously frivolous lawsuits. "Your Honor," Webb began as soon as Morrison called the case, "we move for immediate dismissal under Rule 12b-6. The plaintiff's claims are clearly barred by the statute of limitations, and even if they weren't, he's provided no credible evidence that our client owes him anything." Morrison nodded, already mentally composing her dismissal order. But procedure required her to hear from the plaintiff first, so she turned to Patterson with the polite but distant expression she perfected for these situations. "Mr. Patterson, you have the opportunity to present your case. Please keep it brief and focus on the facts." Patterson stood slowly, glancing at his carefully organized papers. When he spoke, his voice was clear but soft, carrying the measured cadence of someone who'd spent years in the military. "Your Honor, in 1992, I was medically discharged from the Army after 22 years of service. I'd served in Vietnam, Desert Storm, and various peacekeeping missions. When I was discharged, I was rated at 60% disability and began receiving monthly benefits of $843. Morrison glanced at her watch. This was going to take longer than she'd hoped. In January 1994, Patterson continued, I received a letter saying my benefits were being temporarily suspended while they reviewed my file for possible fraud. I was told the review would take 90 days. I waited. I called. I wrote letters. 30 years later, I'm still waiting. He reached into his box and withdrew a stack of correspondence. These are copies of every letter I've sent to the Veterans Administration, the Department of Defense, and Consolidated Benefits Corporation over the past 3 decades. I've been told my file was lost, then found, then transferred to different departments. I've been promised callbacks that never came and hearings that were never scheduled. Webb rolled his eyes theatrically. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of rambling testimony that... Morrison raised her hand. Let him finish, Counselor. Patterson nodded gratefully. I've worked as a janitor, a security guard, and a handyman for 30 years, making minimum wage because that's all I could find with my disabilities. I should have been receiving at least $30,000 a year in benefits. That's $900,000 over 30 years, not counting cost of living adjustments. The number hung in the courtroom air like smoke. $900,000 was serious money, even for a corporate defendant. But Morrison had heard big numbers before, usually from people who'd done creative math with their disappointments. Mr. Patterson, she said gently, do you have any documentation showing that Consolidated Benefits Corporation specifically owes you these benefits? Patterson's shoulders sagged slightly. Your Honor, I've brought every document I have. 30 years of letters, forms, appeals, and denials. I know it looks overwhelming, but somewhere in this paperwork is proof that I've been forgotten by the system I served. Morrison glanced at the cardboard box, which appeared to contain several hundred pages of documents. The corporate lawyers were checking their phones, clearly confident this was heading toward dismissal. The court reporter looked like she was fighting to stay awake. Mr. Patterson, I appreciate your service to our country, and I understand your frustration with bureaucracy. But this court requires specific evidence of legal wrongdoing, not just a collection of correspondence. Do you have any contracts, agreements, or official determinations that show Consolidated Benefits Corporation has a legal obligation to pay you these benefits? Patterson looked down at his papers, suddenly appearing every one of his 72 years. I believe I do, Your Honor. But I'm not a lawyer. I've organized everything chronologically, starting with my discharge papers and ending with the most recent correspondence. If you could just look at what I've brought. Webb stood up smoothly. Your Honor, with respect to Mr. Patterson's service, we can't allow every disappointed claimant to dump boxes of random paperwork on the court and demand a fishing expedition. The plaintiff has had 6 months to present credible evidence. He's failed to do so. We respectfully request immediate dismissal. Morrison felt the familiar weight of judicial efficiency pressing down on her. The docket was full, the case appeared hopeless, and the corporate lawyers were right about the basic legal standards. She'd already spent more time on this than most dismissals warranted. Mr. Patterson, I'm going to give you one final opportunity. Do you have any single document that specifically proves Consolidated Benefits Corporation owes you money? Patterson reached into his box one more time, his hands moving slowly through the papers. He seemed to be looking for something specific, but after a moment he stopped and looked up at the judge. Your Honor, I think the answer is in here somewhere. I've read every document hundreds of times, but I'm not trained to know which one might be legally significant. Could you just look at the last few pages? I put the most recent correspondence at the end. Morrison sighed internally. This was exactly the kind of request that turned 5-minute hearings into hour-long exercises in futility. But something about Patterson's dignity, his refusal to become angry or desperate, made her hesitate. Maybe it was his military bearing, or the way he'd organized his paperwork with obvious care, or simply the fact that 30 years was a long time to pursue something without any vindication whatsoever. Very well, Mr. Patterson. I'll review your final documents before making my ruling. She reached across the bench as Patterson approached with a thin folder containing what appeared to be the most recent correspondence in his case. The pages were photocopies of letters and forms, most bearing official letterheads from various government agencies. Morrison flipped through them quickly, seeing the familiar bureaucratic language of delayed decisions and transferred files. Then she reached the final page, and her world stopped. It was a handwritten letter on official Department of Defense stationery, dated just 6 months earlier. The letterhead showed it came from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the signature at the bottom was unmistakably authentic. But it was the content that made Morrison's breath catch in her throat. "Dear Mr. Patterson," the letter began in careful handwriting. "I am writing to personally acknowledge a grave error that has recently come to our attention. During a comprehensive audit of suspended benefit cases, we discovered that your military disability benefits were temporarily suspended in January 1994 due to a clerical error in our processing system. This suspension was never intended to be permanent and should have been automatically lifted within 90 days. Morrison read the paragraph again, her hands beginning to shake slightly. "Unfortunately, due to a computer system error, your file was never flagged for review, and your benefits were never reinstated. This means you have been wrongfully denied approximately $847,000 in disability payments over the past 30 years. We are working with our contracted benefits administrator, Consolidated Benefits Corporation, to immediately rectify this situation and provide full back payment with interest." The letter was signed by Secretary of Defense Martin Walsh, with a note at the bottom: "Mr. Patterson, your service to this nation deserved better than this oversight. We will make this right." Morrison looked up from the letter to find Patterson watching her with patient hope, apparently unaware that he'd just handed her dynamite. The corporate lawyers were still checking their phones, confident in their impending victory. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet hum of the ventilation system. "Mr. Patterson," Morrison said carefully, "have you shown this letter to anyone else?" Patterson shook his head. "I received it last month, Your Honor. I wasn't sure if it was legitimate or just another bureaucratic mistake. I've been disappointed so many times before." Morrison read the letter a third time, her legal mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just evidence of corporate negligence. It was an admission of systematic failure that had robbed a veteran of nearly $1 million over 3 decades. And according to the letter, Consolidated Benefits Corporation was the contracted administrator responsible for making the payments. She looked across at Webb, who was now paying attention to the sudden change in courtroom atmosphere. "Counselor, are you familiar with your client's role as benefits administrator for the Department of Defense?" Webb shifted uncomfortably. "We administer various benefit programs under government contract, Your Honor, but I'd need to review the specific details of any particular case." Morrison held up the letter. "Mr. Patterson has just provided correspondence from the Secretary of Defense acknowledging that his benefits were suspended due to clerical error 30 years ago and should have been reinstated within 90 days. The letter specifically mentions that Consolidated Benefits Corporation is responsible for rectifying the situation." The change in the courtroom was immediate and dramatic. Webb's confident expression evaporated as he realized what had just happened. His junior associates began frantically searching through their files, looking for information they clearly didn't have. Patterson remained standing at his table, still not entirely sure what the letter meant for his case. "Your Honor," Webb said, his voice lacking its earlier certainty, "we would need to authenticate that document and review our client's records before." Morrison cut him off. "Counselor, are you suggesting that a letter from the Secretary of Defense might be fraudulent?" Webb's face went pale. Challenging the authenticity of official Department of Defense correspondence was not a position any lawyer wanted to take in open court. "Of course not, Your Honor. We simply need time to review our client's files and determine the appropriate response." Morrison leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of what had just unfolded in her courtroom. For 30 years, Robert Patterson had been fighting a battle that everyone assumed he was destined to lose. Government agencies had shuffled his file from desk to desk. Lawyers had refused to take his case. Clerks had treated him like another complaining veteran who wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. And all along, he'd been right. "Mr. Patterson," Morrison said, "please sit down. We're going to take a brief recess while I review this document more thoroughly." In her chambers, Morrison read the secretary's letter again, then used her computer to verify the official letterhead and signature format. Everything checked out. She also looked up the Department of Defense's current policies on benefit administration and discovered that Consolidated Benefits Corporation held several major contracts for processing veteran payments. When court reconvened 20 minutes later, the atmosphere had completely shifted. Webb and his associates were huddled around their phones, clearly trying to reach someone at their client who could explain what they'd walked into. Patterson sat quietly at his table, still organizing his papers with the same methodical care he'd shown all morning. After reviewing Mr. Patterson's documentation, Morrison began, "This court finds that the plaintiff has presented credible evidence of a valid claim against the defendant." The letter from the Secretary of Defense constitutes an official acknowledgement that benefits were wrongfully suspended and that the defendant corporation is responsible for making restitution. She turned to Webb. Counselor, I'm denying your motion to dismiss. Furthermore, given the nature of the evidence presented, I'm ordering expedited discovery so we can determine the full scope of damages owed to Mr. Patterson. Webb stood on shaky legs. Your Honor, we request a continuance to properly prepare our response to these allegations. Morrison nodded. Granted. This case is continued for 2 weeks to allow both parties to prepare for a full hearing on damages. Mr. Patterson, I strongly recommend you retain legal counsel for the next phase of this proceeding. As the hearing concluded and people began filing out of the courtroom, Morrison caught Patterson's attention. Mr. Patterson, may I ask you something off the record? Patterson approached the bench with the same respectful bearing he'd maintained throughout the morning. How did you keep fighting for 30 years without giving up? Patterson was quiet for a moment, then smiled slightly. Your Honor, when you served your country in combat, you learn that some battles take longer than others. But if you know you're fighting for something right, you don't quit just because it's taking longer than expected. 6 months later, the case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, though legal observers estimated Patterson received well over $1 million in back benefits and interest. Consolidated Benefits Corporation also agreed to implement new oversight procedures to prevent similar errors in the future. But the real victory had happened that morning in March, when a judge who was ready to dismiss another hopeless case took the time to read one final document. It was a reminder that justice sometimes hangs on the thinnest of threads, the willingness of one person to listen, the persistence of another to keep believing, and the power of truth to surface even after decades of being buried in bureaucratic indifference. Patterson used part of his settlement to establish a fund helping other veterans navigate the benefits system. He also finally bought a new suit, though he kept the old one as a reminder of the day when 30 years of patience finally paid off in the most unlikely place, a courtroom where almost no one expected justice to be served. The handwritten letter from the Secretary of Defense now hangs framed in Patterson's modest apartment, not as a trophy, but as proof that sometimes the most important documents are the ones that almost never get read. And in courtrooms across the country, judges remember the case of Robert Patterson, the man who taught them that dismissal should never come without careful examination of every piece of evidence, especially the last page. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never gave up fighting for what was right, even when everyone else had stopped believing in their cause? Someone who carried the burden of injustice for years, waiting for that one moment when truth would finally have its day? Tell us in the comments about their persistence and how it inspired you to keep believing that justice, though delayed, is never truly denied. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We'll see you in the next one.